This is aisle 42. Here we go. We're kicking off season 2 of aisle 42 with none other than the food professor. I chatted with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, a leading voice in Canadian agriculture and food policy. He advises all levels of government, he ruffles feathers, and he has a real knack for uncovering the broken bits of our food system. In this episode, we dive into the complexities of food prices, the intersection between sustainability and consumer demand, industry drivers for CPG businesses, the promises and pitfalls of carbon tax, supply chain challenges, the consumer's role in fueling innovation, and the fascinating future of food tech. We even learn about his obsession with poutine. Bet you didn't see that coming. So let's jump in. The future of food starts now. Sylvain, I'm so glad that we're able to connect. I love listening to you and Michael on your Food Professor podcast. It's a great way to catch the food-related headlines. Though I think I'm going to start a drinking game every time Michael says, we're not a political podcast, but I think I'm going to slam a shot of gin, the good kind. And
that's so true. Absolutely. And we
so
try,
true.
I mean, it requires discipline because when you talk about food or agriculture, you really get into the politics quite quickly. So I'm not surprised. I actually was quite clear. I did not, when 5 years ago, when we actually approached me to start the podcast, I did tell him, I don't want a political podcast. There's enough of them, and I don't want to get too political. I just want to focus on issues. And it's like, that's why he repeats it all the time.
He should just put it on a sign behind him or just have a little button that he has to push.
Exactly.
I really love those on location ones that you guys do, like at the coffee conference and other places and spaces. Are you guys going to do more on location stuff in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. We do it when we can. Because, I mean, you probably sense that when you listen to our podcast, when we're actually face to face, it's just so easy to get into heated discussions. And it's much easier than being on camera or on screen. So we try to do it as much as we can. We do it, I guess, 2, 3 times a year right now. But he's in Toronto, I'm in Halifax, and we both travel quite a bit. So it's always tough. But sometimes, actually, once I think it happened once that we actually ended up being in the same city at the same time. So you never know. We may actually cross path again somewhere.
Yeah, you guys got great dynamics, which is awesome. So I want to kick things off with a warm-up question for you, Sylvain. If you could look into your crystal ball and you could redesign the food system of the future, what's the one change that would inspire you the most?
I would say, I mean, without a doubt, putting the consumer in the middle. The consumer has to be the conversation starter for anything. And we say we do it. We say we think about the consumer, but we don't really, especially from a policy perspective. Every week, I'm reminded of the fact that consumers don't really matter as much. So put the consumer at the center of it all and work your way back. What's really neat about consumers is that, well, the market is so fragmented. Consumers are looking for different things for different reasons, and that leads to innovation. And so that's always great. But you need to embrace those opportunities to actually grow the agri-food sector. That's the one thing I would change.
Great answer. You win the prize.
Good stuff.
So I was surprised to discover that not that long ago, you wrote a book about something very Canadian. You traced the global phenomenon around our beloved French fry obsession. You wrote Poutine Nation. I did
Yeah.
not expect to see that title from someone like you. You got to give us the scoop. What inspired you to write a foodie book? And if you were to write another one, what would it be? Maple syrup, Caesar cocktails?
Donaire, who knows? Yeah. Well, I must say, first of all, I wrote 8 academic books, and I was getting tired of writing books nobody read. So you kind of want to write something. And at the same time, I want you to write a book for me. It is the only book written in the first person. There's a lot of me in that book. And I was traveling all over the world. And, at the beginning, I thought, well, why don't I go out and have a poutine? And everywhere I was in the world, it was so easy to get a poutine. And I thought, how can this disgusting, unhealthy dish can be available anywhere around the world? Like, what happened? How can this dish be known everywhere around the world. And that was really the hypothesis that I started with. And of course, I am originally from the region where poutine was invented. And so that's why I wanted to honor the dish. And it is one of the few dishes known around the world that came from a rural setting. Not it's not because poutine was actually coming from regions. It wasn't created in a urban center or some sort like Toronto or Napoli with pizza or Hamburg, an hamburger. Actually, I'm just like half an hour away from Hamburg. That's their pride, right? But Hamburg is a big city. It's a big port city. So, but Warwick is like 5,000 people, and Drummondville is like about 50,000 people. So it's really something that we need to be proud of, I think.
I love it. It's so good. Well, I haven't tracked down a copy of it yet, but I will.
And by the way, some news for you. I've been approached by a filmmaker to actually do a documentary on poutine next year.
No way.
Yep.
You are channeling your inner Stanley Tucci right now. That's very good. I love it.
Probably, I don't know. Like, I think he makes more money than I do, but anyways.
Well, could be true. The title reminded me of the economist Don Thompson from York University. He sort of did a financial forensics on fine and contemporary art auctions and the fashion industry. So a very almost unlikely person to kind of go into those areas. So if you're writing about poutine and next, yeah, maple syrup, I don't know what you got cooking, but anyway, a documentary. That's awesome. Love it. Very cool. So we're recording this what feels like on the eve, like minutes before your 15th food price report comes out. So I'm looking forward to reading that. I'm wondering if I should curl up by the fire and a cup of hot chocolate and read it, or should I be in my basement with a bottle of bourbon? I guess I'll have to wait till it comes out, but so don't
Yeah.
answer that one.
I think chocolate is gonna be more expensive than bourbon, I
Yes,
can tell you.
I think you're right. I think we should all invest in chocolate. One of the things that struck me about, I think it was your last report, was the apparent success of Ireland. A 12% drop in food inflation over there. What are they doing in Ireland and why can't we do that in Canada?
Well, I mean, every country has its own dynamic. It's hard to compare 2 countries, but often we do just to understand if we can learn from another country. In Ireland, I'd say that there is quite a bit of discipline up the food chain compared to Canada, I would say. And I would say the same thing about the UK. The UK went through a lot with Brexit, but I mean, I don't believe there is such a thing as monopolies in the food industry. You and I can start a grocery store if we want. It's just like right now, you have a few players really imposing their rules and laws on everyone else. Because, like for example, if you want to sell a new juice to Loblaw, you have to pay Loblaw $100,000, for example. And the following year, if Loblaw actually realizes that your juice is very popular, well, they're going to charge you $500,000 in listing fee to actually have the right to do business with Loblaw. And of course, you as a juice manufacturer will raise your prices. That tends to actually bring inflation up as a result. I call it supply chain bullying, but that's really what it is. And people don't understand. Well, it's just PepsiCo or Nestle that pays for that, but that impacts inflation eventually, and it impacts retail prices as well. And so countries like Ireland and the UK have actually mastered the ability to control that bullying up the food chain. Even though it's not seen by the public, they do a much better job. And that's how you can actually enhance competition in the country.
Yeah, so let's talk about Canada's grocery code of conduct for a moment. The aim there is to increase trust and fairness and collaboration, which all sounds great. My question to you is will it work? Is this document going to be a guiding light of hope or and actually make food stuff more accessible and more affordable?
Well, I saw the first version of the code, which I thought was pretty exciting because you can feel that with that code, they would actually impose a lot of discipline on companies like Loblaw and Walmart. And frankly, those are the two companies that need to tone it down a little bit to allow manufacturers to cut through all the noise. But the latest edition, the last edition was really different. And so my answer to you is that I don't know. I mean, the fact that all five, the big five, Costco, Walmart, Metro, Sobeys, and Loblaw, they've all signed on this code of conduct is a good step. It's a step in the right direction, but will it work? I don't know. We're going to soon find out in a year or so if it works. My guess is that it's a work in progress. I see it as a work in progress. At least we're talking about it. If 5 years ago you had told me that we would be talking about the code of conduct in the media, I would say you're crazy. But it did happen, so you never know.
All right. Well, let's have some hope for it, I think. Now, to the less hope, let's talk about carbon tax. It's driving up food prices. It's going to continue to drive up food prices. And the rebates are not likely to find their way to those impacted the most. Is there any silver lining in this carbon tax program, or is it doomed greenwashing that's just going to destabilize our food system?
So I'm not an environmental scientist. I can't comment on the functionality of the carbon tax, on whether or not it's actually working. It's actually reducing gas emissions. Even Ottawa is not looking into that. I mean, that's kind of a flawed policy in the first
It's
place.
ironic, isn't it?
If you actually are penalizing industry and building this huge black box that will eventually cost you money or cost us money, you may want to assess whether or not the policy actually works. And we're not seeing that. My concern from day one with the carbon tax is that the government never actually bothered to look at how implementing a carbon tax would actually compromise Canada's food security and food affordability as well for consumers. They never looked into it. So we did. And we found out a couple of things. So we did publish two peer-reviewed journal articles recently in a pretty high ranking international journal. And in January, I'm actually a special editor for Trends in Food Science. We're publishing 11 papers from global scholars. I'll be the one signing the editorial to represent all 11 articles. And really, what we found out is that whether you believe that the carbon tax is impacting food prices or raising food prices or is not at all, both camps, I think, are wrong. It's hard to correlate retail food prices with a policy as complicated as the carbon tax because a lot of things can actually happen. A lot of things can actually impact retail prices, the weather, behavior, loss leaders, promotions. I mean, you name it. We actually felt, based on our analysis, there's too much distortion at retail. So we actually moved up the food chain and looked at wholesale prices. And that's when we started to see some significant differences between Canada and the US. For example, wholesale food prices have actually gone up 40% more than those in the US since 2010 when the carbon tax was implemented. And I've argued in Parliament and to Senate many times, stop looking at retail prices, start looking at our agri-food sector's competitiveness because right now there's something wrong here. And if we are to actually support a less competitive agri-food sector, guess what's going to happen? Grocers will go south, will go anywhere but buying our own food to sell to Canadians. And so these are consequences that are really, really hard to reverse down the road. And we need to be extremely careful, which is why I've always said, let's pause on the carbon tax and truly understand what goes on up the food chain. But the problem is that we're facing a government desperate to amplify the narrative of saying that the carbon tax is costing us nothing, it's not impacting food prices, and it's funding institutes like the Smart Price Prosperity Institute in Ottawa, the Canadian Climate Institute as well. Those are machines, propaganda machines that have actually advocated for Ottawa and supported current policies that are really going nowhere as far as I'm concerned.
Tricky stuff.
Yep.
Well, I'm no researcher, but I do read the retailers' reports on sustainability. Those require bourbon for sure. They say a lot of ESG friendly things to keep investors and the media happy. And there's no doubt that they're doing some good for sure. But younger consumers, younger shoppers are turning up the trust dial. We've seen boycott attempts around price inflation.
Yep.
But when it comes to sustainability, foresee any sort of environmental activism coming to the retailer's front door? Or is this always going to be sort of this separation between environmental activism and people going grocery shopping on a Thursday night?
I don't know. Like, I mean, right now you're seeing a very complicated retail space with social media. People are bombarded with a lot of different information. And as you know, a lot of it is not necessarily supported by evidence, really. And so I'm hearing all sorts of things. So I teach food policy to a graduate class at Dal, and the things I hear, my goodness, it's just unbelievable. Like some people actually believe really outrageous things about the food sector. And to be honest, my concern about that is that the more you have urban citizens not understanding agriculture, the more you'll have bad policy. Really, at the end of the day, that's really what's going to happen. And frankly, I'm concerned, and that's what we're seeing now. The last 5 7 years, as soon as public opinion actually pushes Ottawa to do certain things without really the proper information needed, that's when you get into trouble.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think the sort of profit before planet mandate, which seems to be coming up from the upcoming U.S. administration, do you think that's going to affect ESG initiatives at the Canadian retail level?
I look at that debate from a different angle. I actually do think that most Canadians and some Americans have actually completely forgotten why companies exist in the first place. I mean, that's the first thing I actually say to my food policy class in the fall. So, why do companies exist? Like, well, to make a profit.
To make money,
Well,
yeah.
yes, of course, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's about bringing resources together to build economies of scales, to actually build expertise around certain areas. And the more you do that, the more you actually have an economy that is actually highly functional and productive. That's why companies do exist, is to actually allocate resources much more strategically within the economy. That's really why we do that. And so, but when you have companies in the system, they have to run a profit in order to remain sustainable. Now, the word sustainable really has become something different for a lot of different people. But I do think that right now there is a complete misunderstanding of why companies exist, and why should they exist, and what role should they play in the economy. I do think that most, not all, but most companies do a pretty good job as environmental stewards. But it's that profiteering thing that really skews many people's vision of what companies are actually doing. And I do think that a lot of companies are doing great from an environmental stewardship perspective, but are also incredibly underappreciated by a growing number of people.
Well, I've been reading. I don't know if you've come across these guys at all. It's a group from MIT has done a book called The Demand Revolution, and it's kind of talks about the pent up demand that there is for sustainable solutions, sustainable products. Obviously, there's things like price are a pretty significant barrier, but there's
Yeah.
other barriers to people acting on that. But the one of the things I really loved about the book was they kind of, they did their segments, their different audience segments and different types of personas of people. And that even though there's a lot of differences between these types of consumers, they all have something that they feel like is relevant to their sustainability initiatives or sort of mindset. So even if someone is a bit of a naysayer, they're far from being a tree hugger, but they don't want more food in their green compost bin. Like they want less. And they understand food waste, right? They might not be running out and buying organic cookies, but they understand that they want less in their organics bin. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to sort of hear like there is demand for sustainability coming into the food space, but it's going to have to get sliced and diced to look a little different than just, oh, we got to go after that sustainable conscious shopper.
That demand, I absolutely agree that there's pent up demand for green and sustainable solutions. But I think that the industry itself and government aren't necessarily building a solid case for it either. Right now, what you're seeing are policies that are being implemented with the aim of controlling the weather. I mean, that's really what we're seeing right now because we're basically listening to the climate change hysteria, which I think is unhealthy for everyone, starting with the younger generations. And let's focus on decarbonizing the market, you know, because you can measure that and you can incentivize companies to do it too. A carbon tax leads to climate change hysteria. We need to tax as much as possible while you're killing the economy because we need to make sure that the world becomes colder. That's not how you're going to get people engaged. And that's not how you're going to get industry and governments to build a case for that pent up demand you're talking about. I don't think that consumers are out there wanting to pay taxes to control the weather and control Mother Nature. They're out there because they want a cleaner planet and they wanted to decarbonize the planet. Let's do it for the right reasons. And that's why I'm a bit of a fan of the cap and trade system, to be honest. I actually think that both California and Quebec got it right, especially for the agri food sector. You empower companies to make decisions, you incentivize them. If they actually don't pollute, then they actually can make money. They can actually have carbon credits and sell it to the market. If you want to drive your Hummer and you want to fleet a Hummer, that's your business, but pay up. I think that's fair because right now we're penalizing anybody. And I don't think that's a good way to run the economy.
Well said. I know national food security is one of your favorite subjects, at least from what I can tell. So there's probably a million ways we could go with this. But big picture wise, what stands out as the biggest threat to a resilient supply chain here in Canada? Is it tariffs? Is it broken trade deals? Is it war with Russia, currency problems? There's probably a ton. But what rises above that, above all of those right now for you when it comes to food security?
Logistics and reliant supply chains. It's a no-brainer for me. Food distribution works when dots connect. When the entire system from both ends of the food continuum can actually connect. And the only way to actually connect all of these points is with a resilient supply chain. And that is not what we have in Canada. We've never taken supply chain management seriously in Canada. And we have to. We have no choice. Now, you got Eastern Canada, you got Western Canada. Eastern Canada was blessed with something called the Seaway, the St. Lawrence Seaway. You can actually move products very cheaply. And that's why a lot of the wealth early on in the history of our country was actually built up in Ontario and Quebec, upper and lower Canada. Okay. Out west, you don't have water. You have to build infrastructure in order to actually get merchandise flowing through. And we are an export driven, well, let me rephrase. We're an export reliant economy. We should become a export focus economy. And the only way to do it is it's by relying on a solid, I would say, corridor and gateway system from Winnipeg to Prince George and Vancouver, going through Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatoon, Regina, all that stuff. And of course, it has to be deemed an essential service because there's been so many labor disputes, and those labor disputes have actually impacted Canada's reputation abroad. It's just unbelievable. So to me, no brainer logistics.
I hear you, especially out here out in the West, where there's so many trucks on the road and there's only so many ways across the Rockies. So it's a pretty tricky way.
Yeah, and of course, and that opens up a couple of can of worms, interprovincial barriers. Let's talk about that. Because in Canada, we all know if you talk to a company, they'll tell you right away it's easier to deal with the US than Canada. That is wrong. It shouldn't be that way. And so let's change that.
I agree. So, to the brighter future, an increasing number of grocery categories, there's like good for you products, healthier options, cleaner ingredients are kind of rising, kind of going higher and higher up the consumer's radar. What's it going to take, do you think, to get rid of that expensive natural aisle in grocery stores and decentralize these alternatives so that when we're shopping in a category that we can see, the better options right next to the, well, less than better options?
I'm of the mind that people should make their own choices. Okay. If you want to buy crap, if you want to buy something that's bad for, if you want to indulge, that's your business. The government is there to encourage people to eat certain things. The industry is there to make money. And so we have a moralistic government. We don't need a moralistic industry. So I want to park that right there because a lot of people say, oh, we need to eat healthy. We're humans. We're human beings. Sometimes we want to eat stuff that actually is good for you or that tastes good, but is not necessarily good for you. And that needs to continue if you want to actually enjoy life. So you need a mixture of both. To me, I mean, right now there's a lot of talk about food banks and people going hungry. I'm actually of the mind that we actually have an opposite crisis that we rarely talk about. It's the obesity crisis. There's too many people that have too much weight. They carry too much weight. So let's talk about that. And how do we actually get people to exercise, to lead different lifestyles? And that's something we don't talk much about. The food industry will offer certain food. At the end of the day, it's up to you and I to decide what we put in our mouths. Some people have cravings. Some people will have dependencies. And this is where things really are getting interesting right now with this whole GLP-1 phenomena with Ozempic. And I mean, I spoke to some CPG companies. They're almost insulted to see a pharmaceutical company come in and solve the problems of many people who eat too much. I actually think it's an interesting phenomena. What will happen? I can tell you some CPG companies are pretty nervous right now because they see if you have millions of people who don't impulse buy anymore, how are we going to make money? So you're forcing companies to think differently about the consumer. That bag of chip, that chocolate, before you go to the cashier. I mean, it's going to force really companies to think differently about the consumer for the better, I think. So beyond the ingredients, beyond all that stuff we put in the food, it's the behavior that really I think is going to force companies to do things differently.
And there are some retailers like Whole Foods where they've actually guided the consumer shopping behavior around what they present and how they lay out their stores and obviously what products they carry. But they are just one retailer, and they
But the food basket at also is generally more expensive than average as well.
that's for sure. That's, yeah, very true. By the way, when I shop and I'm hungry, my guilty pleasure is I always buy olives. I crave olives when I'm hungry and I'm grocery shopping. So I
Well,
don't
that's
think I'm going to see that on a strip next to the cashier anytime soon.
there's not too much sugar in olives, so that's good. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that's a good craving.
There you go. Well, my last question for you, Sylvain, is are there any food or technology innovations that have your attention right now, like algae or insect protein or cultured meat or urban farming or AI? What food tech really excites you right now?
Well, I mean, I'm actually here in Berlin at an international protein alternative conference. I'm giving a talk tomorrow about well, what's going on in Canada, and the one thing that really intrigues me is this whole issue of cellular agriculture. You know, making food in a lab in a bioreactor. I mean, I find that very fascinating. And of course, people will second guess the technology. But tomorrow, I'll be presenting with a scholar from Singapore and a scholar from Sweden. And as you may know or may not know, in both countries, one Singapore has been selling cultured meat for a while now. It's legal, and Sweden is actually looking into legalize that meat as well. And Canada is just idle. It's just we haven't received Health Canada has not received an application from any company to actually assess whether or not we should be commercializing these products. But I do think it pushes boundaries in terms of where food comes from. How should we make food? The sustainability file, animal ethics, animal welfare, thinking about how do you actually occupy our vast territory as Canadians if you don't have any farms anymore? What are you going to do? I mean, and of course, like tonight, I was actually talking to an engineer, and how do you actually make that food as affordable as possible? And when you think about meat in particular, you have to think about E. coli, salmonella. Well, with cellular agriculture, You don't have to worry about that anymore. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I actually think it's just a fascinating file that I think most of us haven't really appreciated the complexity of cellular agriculture yet. And by getting together, by talking with each other, scholars from around the world, I'm actually pretty pumped to be here in Berlin and talk about this issue with hundreds of colleagues from all over the world.
Love it. Yeah, it's very intriguing stuff. So, Van, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I know you have still a full day of meetings, even though it's late in Berlin. Thank you for doing the show today.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Aisle 42. If you haven't done it already, hit the link in the show notes and head on over to the Food Professor podcast and tap subscribe. I'll also include a link to Sylvain's latest edition of Canada's Food Price Guide. If you work in the CPG industry and you give a damn about people and our planet, then I'd love to get my team to help you scale more sustainably faster. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, or you can email me directly by sending a message to Corwin@ethicalfoodgroup.com. Okay, that's it for me. I'll see you in the future.